Should the Denver Broncos prioritize tight end in the upcoming free agency period that starts next week? Does Brock Nelson finally fill the hole at second line center and make the Colorado Avalanche a complete Stanley Cup contender? And we will have another guest on the tail end of today's show to count down the latest entry in the High Milestones countdown. All things to come on today's rundown, but we start in the NFL, where we got some news yesterday via Adam Schefter, Ian Rappaport, and the litany of NFL insiders who are furiously typing away as teams continue to shape their rosters about a tight end prospect that could tip the scales on the open market this offseason, and that is Jacksonville Jaguars' now former tight end, Evan Engram. He was once a late first-round pick by the New York Giants, who had some up-and-down years there before moving to Jacksonville, where he came out of the gates on fire, having a season with over 100 receptions and nearly 1,000 yards before falling off a little bit due to injuries and just overall inefficiencies on the offensive side of the ball in Jacksonville. But he is no more. The Jaguars opted not to pay him his north of $12 million salary for the upcoming year, and he will be a free agent open for bidding. The Broncos obviously have a need at tight end, one that they may address both in free agency and in the upcoming NFL draft this April. So the question is, should the Denver Broncos, with Sean Payton and George Payton, pick up the phone and call the representation for Evan Engram to potentially work out a deal to come here? Does pairing Evan Engram with Bo Nix make sense for what the Broncos have financially to offer and what the Broncos have as a roster need? My answer is, I kind of think so. I don't want to say that it's necessarily a slam dunk, yes, because while Evan Engram is just a season or so removed from having nearly 1,000 yards with over 110 receptions, he did seem to peter off a little bit last year, recording under 400 yards with just one touchdown last season. So if you're going on the what have you done for me lately NFL scale, it's not great as it relates to Evan Engram, but that level of production alone, especially in the yardage category, is close to the entire production of the Broncos tight end room as a whole last season. So with the bar being as low as it is, and I think the need to maybe look at blending a veteran free agent type player, both at the running back and tight end position, with a young draft pick to be able to kind of meld a new room together at both positions, I am interested in Evan Engram. And I'll tell you why. Because if you're going to take that approach, which I think is wise, to pair a veteran tight end with an NFL draft pick at the same position, or maybe multiple draft picks, Evan Engram right now, after the news yesterday, may be the top tight end available on the NFL market. And when you look at the other names that are out there, yeah, there are some familiar names. I think a lot of household NFL fans would know the name Zach Ertz and probably Tyler Conklin and Mike Gesicki, who Broncos country and Broncos fans here in the area will remember for carving up the Broncos defense in that overtime loss against Cincinnati. And then you have the likes of Juwan Johnson, who again is a little bit younger than maybe an Evan Engram by about 18 months, but has familiarity with Sean Payton, somebody that's worked in his system before and could potentially meld into the running machine that we've seen underneath Bo Nix. So when you look at those names, Evan Engram, depending on the price, again, Evan Engram was making 2 to 3 times as much as some of these tight ends were just last season with their respective teams, but I don't think he's going to be able to command nearly that in this new current cycle. So if you're telling me that I can get a guy like Evan Engram, who I know we've seen have a ceiling that is higher by an insurmountable measure than any tight end currently on the roster, and you can get it on a 1-year prove-it deal or maybe a 2-year, somewhere in the $5 to $7 million range, I think it's at least worth a phone call and maybe some calculator pushing by the likes of George Payton and others over there at Broncos Park, powered by Common Spirit. It remains to be seen. We'll see the wheels really start to move on Monday morning with that first news cycle, and that's when the legal tampering period starts, which again is one of the more favorite terms in the NFL world that makes no sense to me. But I think we'll really start to see the gears moving then, and we'll have a greater picture of what the Broncos are thinking at that point. As it relates to the NHL, the Colorado Avalanche last night overwhelmed the San Jose Sharks in an appearance that featured a familiar feeling, I think, for a lot of Avs fans, only this time they were on the right side of it, as old friend Alexander Georgiev was between the pipes for San Jose and looked a lot like Alexander Georgiev. It wasn't a 3-Giev. It wasn't a 4-Giev. It wasn't a 5-Giev. It was a 7-Giev for Georgie last night in San Jose, as the Avalanche absolutely peppered their former goaltender. Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar each notching a pair of goals and each having 4 and 3 assists respectively, combining for 11 total points between two of your top stars here in Colorado. Cale Makar became the first defenseman since Paul Coffey in the 1980s to record a 6-point game, and he also set history for the most points by an Avalanche defenseman in a game in franchise history. So a little bit of since 1980 history and a little bit of all-time franchise history for our boy Cale Makar last night. The biggest news of the night, though, actually came about 2/3 of the way through that game in San Jose when the Avs had already hung 5 goals on Georgie, and it looks like they may be able to hang a few more on future teams coming up as they worked out a deal with Lou Lamoriello and the New York Islanders to bring in center Brock Nelson in exchange for prospect Callum Richie and some draft compensation coming back both directions. So as it relates to Brock Nelson, the biggest question already is going to be, can he fill the hole that is vacated, basically, still to this day, post-departure of Nazem Kadri after the Stanley Cup win in 2022? I think that Brock Nelson, as Mike Evans and I talked on the show yesterday, was one of, if not the top coveted prospects, especially at his position, that remained among the free agency boards if you were to look around the league. So I think this is another situation where Chris McFarland saw another need, executed what was needed to execute in order to bring it in, and continues to leave no stone unturned as it relates to this team and reimagining this roster from top to bottom to try to bring them back to cup contention. This was a chip pushing into the center of the table. And again, when you really look at the trade compensation for the package, the Avalanche acquire Brock Nelson and William Dufour while giving up a young, talented prospect in Callum Richie and Oliver Shillington, who's already been dealt for future draft compensation considerations by the Islanders, along with a conditional 26 or 27 first-round pick and a conditional third-round pick in 2028 as well. So by the time those draft pick compensations are going to be coming forward, we're talking about late-round picks from 3 years from now. You are giving up a prospect in Callum Richie, and Shillington, who, again, the Avs obviously felt him as a movable piece. The Islanders felt that he was a piece that wasn't worth retaining, and he has already moved on. So when you really look at this, it seems like if you're going prospect to prospect on paper with that much draft compensation attached to it, that it's a pretty heavy haul for a second-line center. But in all actuality, to me, that's just the cost of doing business, baby. The Avs are all in, and Chris McFarland is acknowledging that and putting his chips behind the fact that this is a team that has to win now. And that sentiment was echoed by the team's captain, Nathan MacKinnon, when he was asked about it after the shelling of San Jose. Nathan MacKinnon's response in the nature to the question about going all in this season, Nate Dogg said, "You have to. This is our year. It's up to us, but there's no other way. We're not in rebuild mode yet." So there's a little subtle nod at the end there from Nathan MacKinnon to say, hey, we know that this window might be closing soon, but it ain't closed yet. And so I think that is an acknowledgement from the team's captain, who's normally kind of surly and monotone as it relates to talking to the media. He wasn't really that when talking about the acquisition of Brock Nelson, with whom he shares a strength trainer with, by the way. So there is some familiarity there. And Coach Jared Bednar also spoke highly of Brock Nelson when he found out about the trade after the game. Because again, all of this happened about 30 minutes in to the Avalanche game against San Jose. Jared Bednar, as it relates to Brock Nelson, said he's been pretty pleased with it. Huge ad. He's always been trusted as a 200-foot player. And if you look at his history, he's scoring 30-plus goals most years too. To get a player of that caliber is hard to do. I agree. And again, I just think it points to the nature. When you look at the Colorado Avalanche as a team under Chris McFarland's general managership, the identity that they have is aggressive. And they were like that, as Mike Evans pointed out yesterday, in the mid 90s and early 2000s in their pursuit for cups, of which they won 2 in 5 years. And there's an argument to be made, maybe with how close some of their finishes were in between those 2 cups, that they should have won more, but they were aggressive in their pursuit of it, and they would not be denied. And that is a similar identity to what I believe we are seeing here now with Chris McFarland and the Colorado Avalanche. Because let's face it, if you look at the way that the 2 teams that share Ball Arena as a home operate, we're seeing a pretty significant fork in the road as to how those 2 front office men are handling things. Chris McFarland is, hey, the window is closing. We've got to win right now. I'm all in, as I shove my microphone into my chin. I am all in, and if it doesn't work out, we'll deal with those pieces and pick those up where they fall. Whereas with the Nuggets and Calvin Booth, you're seeing more of a, we want to win now because we have Nikola Jokic, the greatest player in the world, and we have this core with Jamal and AG and Michael Porter Jr., but we also want to win from now on. And I understand that there are different rules of engagement as it relates to the NBA and the NHL, and that it's not necessarily an apples to apples comparison of structurally as it relates to the league. But again, I think so much of this has to do with the mindset, the decision that you make as an organization, and the front that you put forward, both internally to your players and your coaches and externally to the rest of the league. It's important to identify that. The Nuggets is a little bit murkier. The Avs, not so much. And I give Chris McFarland, Jared Bednar, and all of the people in there that make those wheels turn over at Ball Arena for the Avalanche, I give them a lot of credit for that. Because again, if you look at the first decision that really started to snowball this thing down the hill, it was the decision to ship Mikko Rantanen to Carolina in exchange for Marty Necas and Jack Drury. And that signified to me the first real tip of the domino that's going to fall all the way down the line, because Mikko Rantanen is a 100-plus goal scorer for the last 2 seasons, and somebody whose jersey is almost certainly going to hang in the rafters of Ball Arena as a 10-year player for the organization for the first decade of his career. But it wasn't working with the front-heavy top 6, and Chris McFarland acknowledged that. He dealt Mikko Rantanen not at the deadline. He dealt him 6 weeks before the deadline to Carolina in exchange for those 2 players in draft compensation. And guess what we learned earlier this morning? The Carolina Hurricanes are now in the process of dealing Mikko Rantanen again before the deadline to the Dallas Stars, who will now sign him to a 8-year, $12 million per year contract extension, which, if you'll remember, is only about $250,000 or so more than what the Avalanche were originally offering him in that 11.75 range there. Now, you're going to hear people and see people on social media talk about the state income tax difference between Colorado and Texas, and all of that's great. Miss me with the gerrymandering political splicing of you pay this, you pay there. Remember, all these guys are still subject to jock taxes, where they have to pay the taxes based on the states where they play road games. And if you do the math, if you follow down the nerd roll there and you do the math, I think he ends up saving about $300,000 a year over the course of the contract. So it adds up to maybe, I don't know, $4 million, 4 and change by the end of that. So all of this, as it relates to Mikko Rantanen, seems to be boiling down to he was that hell-bent, or he and his agent, because I do think they work in tandem, were that hell-bent on saving that amount of money that it was worth shutting down negotiations with the Stanley Cup winning team that you won a cup with, who is still in contention to this day, to go to Carolina, arguably the best team in the East, and say, hey, you're not meeting my number either, to then get interest from the Los Angeles Kings, who are also a playoff caliber team, and say it's not even worth me getting on a plane to come see you because I don't want to play there, to now in Dallas, where it started at, hey, you're not at my number, because remember, again, Mikko is looking for north of $13 million, up in the 13.5 range, which would put him near Leon Draisaitl, he shares an agent with, and all of that to lead to an 8-year, $12 million deal upcoming as reported, with the Dallas Stars. So if you look at the Colorado Avalanche and what their new lines are supposed to look like now, post Brock Nelson trade, you're going to have your usual top line of McKinnon centering Lehkonen and Necas. You'll have Brock Nelson slide in as your 2C alongside Val Nichushkin and Jonathan Drouin. Middlestat, who may or may not be dealt if there's another deal to be had at the deadline for Chris McFarland. But for now, Middlestat centers Kivi Ranta and Ross Colton, and Jack Drury, who came over from Carolina, will be there with VC and Logan O'Connor. That's a pretty solid fourth-line combo with Drury and O'Connor, if I do say so myself. And let's not forget that Parker Kelly and Miles Wood are also available options there. So again, going back to the mindset piece for the Colorado Avalanche, if you don't think Chris McFarland is all in on this season, and I'll give credit to our guy Kyle Keefe, who put this out there on the broadcast. Marty Necas, who was acquired and brought into Colorado, led his team in scoring. Brock Nelson tied for the team lead in scoring for his team. Lindgren, who they brought in, top defensive pairing for his former team. Jack Drury, excellent face-off percentage. So you look at all of these things, and there still may be more moves to come. Keep your eye out for the likes of maybe a Mario Ferraro from San Jose, who we just saw against the Avs last night, or a Brandon Carlo from Boston. Both of those pieces may require moving Casey Middlestat and freeing up some of that salary. But we are literally less than a half hour or so away from the end of the trade deadline, and the Avs may not be done yet. Super exciting, super thankful to have a front office at Ball Arena with the Colorado Avalanche who recognizes their window and pushes the chips in the table to prevent it from closing without giving it the best shot to win a title as possible. All right, enough of a rant from me for that. It is time for our Mile High Milestone Countdown presented by your local Ford dealers. We are nearing the top 25 of the top 30. We sit today at number 26, which takes us to the Denver Nuggets, who were dubbed by NBA broadcasting legend Mike Breen as the comeback kids from Colorado after they came back from back-to-back 3-1 deficits during the COVID bubble playoffs back in 2019-2020. And to take this trip down memory lane with me, I want to bring in a familiar face to all of you and a familiar face to me, and that is Zach By, co-host of The Drive with Zach By and Philip Lindsay. Zach, this is not a drill. Happy to have you on the show with us here today. Appreciate you taking some time. If we look back, Zach, at the 2019-2020 postseason there, which feels like a lifetime ago at this point, based on the growth that we have seen from this Nuggets team specifically, I think when we look back on that, there's still a divergence in thought on whether or not the bubble playoffs were easier for teams to play in or harder for teams to play in. Harder in the sense that you're quarantined in Walt Disney World in Orlando and you have the mental grind that's there, but also that it allows these basketball players, who are some of the best athletes in the world, to play in essentially a vacuum where there is no fans or crowd noise and no travel to alter teams. Which side do you fall on as it relates to the environment that those teams, including those that the young Nuggets roster, were playing on in the playoffs? Do you think it was easier to play in the bubble where we saw the Lakers go on to win a title, or was that more difficult than what we've seen in the regular postseason since?
You want to know what? I think in different ways, it was harder. In other ways, it was easier, and we live in a world where we want to define it and put a label on it, and I understand that. But I think that when you talk about guys being removed from their families, being isolated to a degree that has never happened before and hopefully never happens again, that's much, much harder from a mental standpoint. Shooting in a gym as opposed to an arena, that's easier. That's how these guys come up playing. They don't come up in arenas, right? They shoot in gyms. Even in the off season, they still shoot in gyms. They don't shoot in arenas. So having that close backdrop, we saw some of the greatest shooting performances in NBA history, quite frankly, because of that fact. But here's what I won't do. I would not remove credit from a team like the Nuggets for coming back 3-1 twice, and I would not remove credit for the Los Angeles Lakers winning a championship. I don't believe that. It was just different. It was easier in some ways, harder in others, but I think it was just different. And I've heard some folks say, "Hey, that championship doesn't count."
Yeah,
I just don't
Mickey
think
Mouse.
that you can. I don't think that you can do that. Everyone was there. Everyone competed their butts off, and the Lakers won it. The Nuggets made history. And hopefully a scenario like that never happens again.
100%. And I agree with you that in terms of the credit, Yes, I think that it allowed for circumstances that under normal, rules of engagement or rules of operation, we wouldn't see. I mean, the Nuggets at the time that they came back from their first 3-1 series against Utah, which came down to a slightly off-center shot from Mike Conley that could have ended the whole dream. At that point, they became the 12th team to come back from a 3-1 deficit and then would become the first team ever in NBA history to come back from multiple 3-1 deficits in a single postseason, and they did them back-to-back. If you were to make me, and I know you are as well as a betting man, if you were to make me bet money on whether or not another team is going to be able to do that, period, let alone in consecutive back-to-back series, I genuinely think there's a realistic possibility that the Nuggets are the only team in NBA history ever to accomplish that because of the unique circumstances that the bubble provided. What say you?
Yeah, totally. And look, I think that's where, one of the points of someone that is a detractor of the bubble title or the Nuggets bubble run is that it would have never happened in front of an away fans crowd. And look, there's just no way of knowing. Do I think that we're going to see it again in my lifetime? Maybe. I mean, it's sports. This is why we watch. Do I think it's going to happen in the next 10 years? No. 20 years? Probably not. 50 years? Maybe. And when it does happen, they're going to have to bring up that version of the Denver Nuggets. And maybe Jokic will be 70 years old and they will show that team. And if it does ever happen again, they'll say it's the first time since, not just the first time ever. And that's pretty darn cool.
Looking back on, again, I mentioned it at the top here about the growth that we've seen from the Nuggets since this point. I think if you were to look back at that 2019-2020 bubble postseason and what we saw the Nuggets do there, eventually losing to the Lakers, again, on what felt like maybe a singular moment with Anthony Davis hitting that three-point shot off a failed switch by Mason Plumlee, in which we saw KCP, since coming to the Nuggets, say, hey, if AD doesn't hit that shot and we don't win that game, the Nuggets might have beat us that year. So without going too far down the what could have been path, I think when I look back at this postseason series, this postseason run, I don't know if calling it the Genesis point maybe feels a little too strong, but I think that this bubble playoff run and the dueling 50 burgers between Jamal Murray and Donovan Mitchell, and then demoralizing the Clippers in the second round and accomplishing this first ever clip, especially with the dominant Game 7 shut the door against LA. This really felt like a true validating point for this young Nuggets core to both show that what they're capable of now and what this core is capable of as they continue to grow. We saw Jamal Murray answer the bell and answer the call, a guy who's never been an all-star in his career and kind of has this really mercurial up and down nature. We saw a slimmer Jokic and an emergence of his MVP track kind of build and grow from there. Do you think it's fair to call that period, that bubble run, was kind of a validating metal testing period that helped the Nuggets continue on the trajectory that we've seen?
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, what you want to phrase it is up to you. The way that I would say it is they were already growing up, and that was their puberty spurt. That what happened in the bubble was the Nuggets entering puberty, and then the following subsequent seasons, them becoming a full-grown man and a champion. And it was, we have to remember the Nuggets at that time. The Nuggets have been talked about so much since then, from a championship perspective, a Jokic MVP perspective. We're going on 4 or 5 years of having these conversations, but at that time, the Nuggets legitimately became the biggest story in sports at that moment. Literally. And I remember it vividly where the comeback against the Clippers to finalize it was actually happening on week 1 of the NFL season. So think about how popular and massive week 1 of the behemoth that is the NFL. And I remember being at a house and they just had the one TV and we were outside because it was still kind of COVID-y stuff going on. And it was, what are we going to put on the TV? Week 1 of the NFL or the Denver Nuggets against the Clippers. And we were watching the Nuggets against the Clippers in a way that I could have never forecasted, even a week earlier, let alone a month or a year. They became the biggest story in the NBA. And it was fantastic. And you just got like the display of shot making from Jamal Murray during that stretch. It's like mythical. It really is. So I'll remember it for the rest of my life. And it was truly the new jumping off point for the Denver Nuggets, the new standard of, okay, this team can go to the Western Conference Finals. Before, they had never won 2 playoff series. So it was Genesis, no, because the building blocks came before that. But they entered a portal and came out the other end at the end of the Clippers series that you could have never imagined at the start of the Utah series.
I love it. And I love the correlation that you made to puberty, because again, I think that fits right in line to what may be my favorite, maybe second favorite behind a double bang Mike Breen call of all time, which is the comeback kids from Colorado. They were kids at that point, and I think that I totally agree with your analogy. I think they emerged closer to men on the other side, and we've seen the maturation process go from there. Zach, as it relates to the group of now grown men that we see taking the court this season, what have you made of the discourse and the fallout post LA Lakers game, where we saw the topic of the Jokic defense and the Jokic rules as it relates to how teams look at defending the Nuggets in this upcoming postseason in a stacked and loaded Western Conference? What have you made of the shift toward that and the Nuggets' ability to potentially adapt and move around it as the postseason looms larger?
Yeah, the way that the Lakers put out the blueprint of how to guard Jokic is really interesting. I don't know how sustainable it is against a supercomputer like Nikola Jokic, who over the course of a 7-game series will download the information that's being thrown at him and adjust accordingly. Because I do think there's a couple wrinkles that the Nuggets are purposely leaving inside their bag for the postseason. That's the hope anyway. And if not, they're in trouble. But it's a really unique style. And I've heard guys talk about it saying, well, it's not like Jokic has never seen a double before. This isn't a double. This is 4 or 5 guys all guarding Jokic at one time and tempting and daring non-3-point shooters to simply shoot. And even if guys like Russell Westbrook, Christian Brown, even Aaron Gordon in the 3-point shooting season he has, even if they make shots on a certain night, there's a scenario where you can win the battle but still lose the war over the course of a 7-game series. In terms of the way that and of course we'll continue to watch it unfold here in the last 20 games and into the postseason. But in terms of the way that Jokic has been guarded here with the over the top physically aggressive defense in a way that we might have not seen since Shaquille O'Neal. I mean, guys are just absolutely owning the aggressiveness. They're not trying to hide it. And the NBA, since last year's post All-Star break, has been calling games differently. They're letting the guys play more. They changed the rules on the fly. But the rules are really different for big men, really different. Where even if a guard was coming from the perimeter and took the same contact that Jokic takes 9 out of every 10 possessions, that guard's at the free throw line still, even with the different whistle. Jokic just isn't getting them, and you're seeing him just hammered. And what we saw the other night is a smaller defender thrown on Jokic against the Sacramento Kings and really just hammered him. And there's this psychological thing that's going on with officials that they're watching a smaller defender trying to guard the league's MVP, and they're allowing smaller defenders play even more aggressive than the guys that are Jokic's size play. So it's one of these things where I was critical on the air of Michael Malone yesterday, because you're seeing this now game after game for 4 or 5 games in a row. And Michael Malone is asked about the officiating, and he said, well, I'm not really going to tell you how I feel unless you guys start a GoFundMe, in terms of he's going to get fined if he shares his actual thoughts. Well, guess what, Coach? You make about $8-9 million a year. That's not the responsibility of, and I know he was joking, but I'll joke back with him. It's not the responsibility of the media to start a GoFundMe for you. It's your responsibility to protect the best player in the world with your platform in that press conference setting, and set the tone for the rest of the league that what's happening is completely unacceptable. We've seen this in the past with Steve Kerr. We've seen it with Eric Spoelstra. We've seen it with Greg Popovich. The king of it was Phil Jackson. Set the agenda, and because you cannot continue even getting a tech. He got a tech in the first minute of the Detroit Pistons game. It's one of the quickest techs in NBA history. That's fine because it could impact that night. But when you do it at the presser in the way that needs to be done, it reverberates across the NBA. That, I believe, has to happen before the NBA playoffs start.
Well, they've got a few games left to try to iron it out. We'll see if Michael Malone takes some of your sage advice, which I agree with, as it relates to the handling of Nikola Jokic, who you can say anything you want about with whistles and defense and star calls and this and that. I don't see many players, let alone smaller guards, who get to the line that are as bloodied and literally bloodied and battered as Nikola Jokic is on a night in, night out basis, with little to no kind of needle moving on a national level. So, Zach, I love it. Thank you for helping us take this walk down memory lane as we count down the 30 biggest storylines here in Denver sports as a part of our 30th anniversary celebration at Denver Sports 104.3 The Van. Zach, we will all be tuned into you and Phil later at 2 o'clock, and I can't wait to see what you guys have in store. Thanks again, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Richie. Great stuff.
All the rest of you out there, have a great rest of your day. We'll catch you at the same time in the same place tomorrow.
I do what I love what I do. Second nature to put in